real things have natures in a way that artificial things do not. What we've done is we've surrounded our things with all these things that don't have real natures. Agrarian literature is important, is to put us back in touch with real reality.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Aboud, and I am here with our core four. Welcome back, guys. Glad to have you.
Well, it's good to be here.
I know. How's everybody doing? We're in the thick of the winter, rainy, dreary.
Winter, doldrums, cold.
I know. Has it been
ready for spring to shine?
Are you seeing any signs of spring on the farm?
Many more eggs. Days are getting longer.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, they are.
Nice.
Yeah. When I left for vacation, we were getting 5 eggs a day out of our, 150, 200 chickens or whatever.
Oh my.
And when we got back, we were at 35. Now we're at 60. So
what's normal like in the summer?
Well, a high producing chicken will produce 200 to 250 eggs a year.
Oh, wow.
So it's not quite one a day, but during the summer it should be about one a day, and during the winter they kind of stop. So, and I got too many roosters right now. So, but they'll be helpful. We need to incubate some of our own eggs and get some new life. That's on the plan for in a couple of weeks.
Well, as we await the spring, have you been reading anything?
Yes, I've been reading. I started a Icelandic epic.
Oh,
Independent People. I tried reading it a couple years ago. Mitchell gave it to me, and I didn't get through the first part. Like I've gotten now past like an introductory thing, so now I'm like getting into the story. And Mitchell says I'm going to love it.
He does love those Norse tale books.
Does.
He always recommends those.
Yeah, it's it's about a sheep farmer who works very hard to own his own land, and then his daughter wants independence from him. So like he's worked for independence from everybody else, so now she wants independence from him, and the struggle.
That sounds pretty good.
Well, if you're reading Icelandic epics, you're not one of those people who's looking for the hot new thing.
Right.
Please.
This won, I think, the Nobel Prize for Literature in the 50s, I want to say.
How about you, Tanya?
I'm still reading The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I'm about halfway finished, and I do like it. It is totally different than Charlotte and Emily's more famous books. I'm a little angry at Charlotte because after Anne died, she died when she was 29, Charlotte just refused to have this book be published. And I don't know.
Do you know why?
Because at the time it caused a real stir because of the content of the plight of woman.
Interesting.
It's a little bit too feminist,
too progressive for the time.
Yes, for the time. And so maybe Charlotte was trying to protect Anne and her reputation. Mm-hmm. That could be.
Interesting.
Either that or she just didn't want her sister to be.
Siblings.
I don't know.
Martin, how about you?
I have just started a Macy Dobbs novel.
Really?
Oh, I love Macy Dobbs.
Yeah, I was
I've read them all.
Tanya
I'm sorry.
I thought
for everybody else's sake, I don't know who Macy Dobbs is.
Well, the author is Jacqueline Winspear. Mm-hmm. And the first one is very good. Like her dad, they're British, of course.
Yeah, tell the setting here.
Yes, so the dad is a fruit monger. So they're very, very much of a lower class. And she gets a job when she's like 13.
And this is taking place when?
Is it? I don't know. Because I've read them all.
Well, they're referring to the war.
Yeah, it's before World War II. Maybe is it between the wars?
I think it's between the wars.
Or is it World War I? Anyway, it's early 1900s at some point, but I don't remember.
I love the setting.
When. So she's in this really nice house, now working as a maid, and then she discovers the library, and she stays up at night reading by herself, and then she really educates herself. And the owner of the house, the wife, catches her. And so she basically sets her up for a good education with a tutor who then becomes her mentor.
Oh, wow.
And he's like a psychologist, but he solves crimes. And so Maisie then takes over for him. She works for him, and then she, throughout the books, gains her independence. And
they come off to me to be utterly authentic. They're really sort of down to earth, very straightforward. There's nothing fancy. It's the book. I always have a book I'm reading just for fun, just what you'd call a good book.
Mm-hmm.
Not a great book, but a good book.
Right.
And these are really good books.
They are.
That's wonderful.
Are you just on the first one?
I'm just on the first one. I can't
You've
say.
got so many to go. But she just wrote the last one. She just published the last one that will ever be in that series.
Because it's so hard for modern authors to capture the mindset of somebody living in a very different world, mm-hmm. but somehow, the author manages to do that, mm-hmm. or at least make it believable to you.
Well, let's kick off today's episode how we've been doing normally, which is answer a listener question from our Memoria Press. It's podcast at memoriapress.com. So if you have questions, email us because we will try to answer one a week. And I'm going to start with kind of describing this question from Charles, which is a two-parter. And part of his question is this. He says, I want my future children to be classically educated. However, I am far from so. I understand that your homeschooling program offers teaching with some prep before the class. However, I don't want my children educated. I want to be educated. As someone around their 30s, where should I start or go? I've been trying to read more books, increasing the difficulty as I go to get my brain ready for books that provoke deep thought. But besides that, I'm not sure where to go. And the second part of his question, he says he's curious about how we're able to connect literature to other literature so well. So kind of connecting those. Where do I start? And then how do I do it and make it all connect?
I think that's really good that he says, that he is reading harder and harder books, because I think that's a great point that he's making, mm-hmm. that really can help people. Mm-hmm. I think if you haven't been reading, if you've just been reading British murder mysteries and nothing, you're probably not ready for Anna Karenina, mm-hmm. but you would be ready for Jane Austen.
Right.
That there, you do have to train your brain, mm-hmm. that reading fluff is, it's great. And as Martin said, we all get great enjoyment from it, but mm-hmm. it's really hard to read a great book and be able to get out of it what you need to without. And I just think so many people think I'm going to educate myself, and they just start at a level that they're not comfortable with, and then they feel like they fail.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that also goes to the sort of the time period of the language being used. Mm-hmm. And so, that was one thing reading this Icelandic epic. The first page, I'm having to look up a word that I just don't understand. Mm-hmm. And it was a Scottish sort of origin, and it just isn't often used. And the translator translated it from the Icelandic into English using that sort of older word. And so that kind of stuff can trip you up. But, I remember trying to read Anna Karenina too. Sometimes it is the translation.
Sometimes
First time I tried reading Anna Karenina, what actually tripped me up was the sheer amount of characters and the different names for all the different characters.
And War and Peace.
And so, but also don't get discouraged if you try to pick up a book that's too much for you. And sometimes the right method is power through it. You won't enjoy it, but then once you get through it to the end, you may come back to it in a year, and at that point, when you read it, you're gonna enjoy it in a way that you did. And sometimes the right move is put it aside, go read something else, come back to it again later. And I do both of those things. If I hit a book that it's just not the right season for me, it's too much intellectually for the time that I've got set aside for it. And so, but his question is, how do you become educated? Really, it is read books.
Yes.
And I remember, this was years ago, Martin, but you stopped me in the break room once and you were asking me what I was reading. And I told you, And I said, but I'm so discouraged because I understand about a sentence a page. And you said, that's great. Keep going. You have to. You said, yeah, well, I should actually, to Paul's point, go back and reread it. But you said, don't quit it. You have to do that. And I was like, okay.
I mean, well, it goes to my point number 4 here, which I wrote down this one, which was actually point number 3. Make reading a discipline and therefore eventually, hopefully, a habit. Okay, you have to, if you want to be a learned person, you have to have a plan, and it doesn't necessarily be a written plan, but you know, you have to be disciplined in the way you do it. You have to know what you need to read. You have to be always looking for what the next book's going to be, that sort of thing. Can I say my other points that
Please.
were very brilliant here? Okay.
Oh my.
Teaching your own children. I mean, if you're teaching your own children, you are learning what they're learning. And, you know, we've got all these, I guess these are related to our theme today. We've got all these children's books here, and I'm looking at these and thinking of all the things that I learned from these books and and reading them to my children and all that. You learn so much by teaching your own children, and that's why I've always I say this over and over again. Homeschooling mothers are going to save the world because they've taught their kids and they've gotten this great education themselves. By teaching it, that they will take that will benefit them for the rest of their lives, right? So teach your own children. Good books before great books. John Sr. gave this advice. He said you need to read the 1,000 good books before you can attempt the 100 great books.
Wow.
And I think that's really true. And children's literature is part of that body of good books. Reading Heidi. Reading Charlotte's Web, reading Little House on the Prairie is a preparation for reading the book that Paul's got in front of him, which is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, you know.
You're absolutely right about that point, because we started our Memorial Press book club over 10 years ago.
Read aloud.
And we were literally reading children's books. That's what we started with. And we did that for probably a couple of years before.
Well, that's what we got through all of them.
Yeah, and then we're like, okay, now we're going to go read adult books.
We did. We started with 3rd grade.
Yeah.
And we read all the novels in the 3rd grade read aloud set. And then we moved on through 6th grade.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. I mean, don't say, oh, well, you know, that Memorial Press has that in their 4th grade curriculum. I don't need to read that. No, go read it.
That's right.
And occasionally I will go pick something up like Robin Hood or King Arthur, you know, and just.
And then once you've done that, then, you know, our scope and sequence will make you a learned person. So if you go through, once you're ready for Homer, then if you read Homer and Virgil and Dante and Augustine, you will be as educated as anybody.
And you'll see the connections. That was his other question. How do you find connections?
And we are going to talk about that today.
Right.
And we're working really hard to help people see the connections, you know, as we re-edit these literature guides that we're doing, which is just a long project, but they are starting to come out now. And so our goal is to point out the connections and common themes that run through each one, because we feel like that was something that we were missing.
Right.
And point 4.
Oh my. Yes, Martin.
I know you're waiting for this. Discuss them.
Right.
Get in a discussion group.
Yeah, get somebody to read with you.
Yeah, get somebody to read with you. And part of what that helps in the discipline part, because you got a due date, you know. Yeah. And so you need all of the help you can get in doing this. You need excuses to do them, and this is a good excuse. Well, if you're going to talk, I might just go a little bit further here.
I can see your paper. It stops at 4 points, and we've gone through all of them.
Is your point about the question? I have one more thing to say in response to the question before we move on.
I was going to say something in response to the question.
Did you forget what it was? Would you like me to continue?
I'm going to make my point while you come up with it.
Literally.
I wanted to say.
Make it a good one.
He said something like, I'm not worried about educating my children. I want to be educated. And Martin's point was, yeah, teach your children. You will be educated as you go through that process. But I think that's a very valid point of like, it is noble to want to be educated yourself.
Absolutely.
Right? It is, you know, just to say, well, I want to give my kids this, but I'm not doing the work to do that. that's also noble. You want your children to get something more than you had, but it's a very noble thing for him to say, I don't even have children of school age, but I want to be educated so that I can hand that on. And that's step one. So
yeah, that's a great closer. Yeah. I wish I had remembered mine to say before yours, because I was just going to point out, we've talked about literature only, but history is the same thing. Just start with our little history books, read the famous men books, and then read the Mills books, and then work yourself up. There's so much good history out there. But the other thing is, if he's going to educate his children classically, he needs to teach himself Latin. And we make that very possible. So I would definitely add that to his list.
But I also wouldn't, he seems a little worried that he needs to remember everything in a book. Or a lot of things.
That was the other thing I was going to say. Mark your books.
Oh, mark your books is great.
Mark your books. And then you can go back to them. So say you are reading something that you're understanding one sentence of at a time, then just move on and keep reading. But then when you start thinking, I remember this connection somewhere else to, let's say, agrarianism, just a segue in to a common theme, you can go back and very quickly find, I was looking for a particular passage in Anna Karenina this morning before we did this, and I couldn't find it because I don't have my book with me that is marked. But if you've got your book marked, you can very quickly go back through with the things that you marked that hopefully will be the things that will be connections in other books. Yeah. And it really does become kind of like a little...
And Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book, I think is helpful in this regard, because what we're talking about here is that fourth step that he talks about in there, which is reading syntopically, which is relating what you're reading now to what you read in some other book. And the more you make those connections, the better you are at making those connections.
Right. Good tips for Charles. Good tips. And
now we're going to practice, right?
We are, because we're going to use Martin's point 4 to have a discussion about a common theme in literature. And today's common theme is agrarianism.
This is in honor of Paul.
I was just going to say,
farm.
I'm starting with Farmer Paul here.
I would like to be clear that I did not campaign for this. Just my own being maybe campaign for, but I did not explicitly push for this.
You're a living campaign, Paul.
Yes. Yeah.
So to start with you, Farmer Paul, why is agrarianism a theme that's important to discuss?
Well, actually, I didn't say this on the podcast. I think I said this in a meeting where this came up because I was in a meeting with other classical. Well, we were having dinner with a bunch of other classical educators, and I was talking about my farm, and they all kind of looked at me like I had two heads. Like, why is this important for you to have a farm? And as I was just sort of explaining this, it dawned on me that this is a major theme in literature. And as classical educators, this should just be part and parcel of humanity has struggled with this idea and elevated this idea of us somehow being connected to the natural world we live in, that I was like, this should be a given for you. And I was just kind of surprised. But it was also classical literature that drove me to the farm. And I've credited for years that the reason I wanted a farm was because of Anna Karenina and Jayber Crow. Now I'm throwing Wendell Berry already in the classic literature, but I think I can do that. And the major reason was because Anna Karenina gave me a picture of a path of encountering God in the natural world. And that was just something I could tangibly hold, right? Wendell Berry gave me the sense of community. And that community in a small community is actually a deeper community than in a larger one. And so those two things together made me say, okay, there is a good that I want in trying to live in a rural area and constantly be getting dirt under my fingernails. So that's that. I don't know. It's kind of an introduction, but my wife's favorite book is one her two favorite children's books are The Little House and Make Way for Ducklings, and
which are total opposites.
They are opposites, but they deal with the same idea of home.
Yes.
But also there's still a Make Way for Ducklings, even though it's set in Boston. There is a recognition of the space we have to give for the natural world.
Yes.
Which I feel.
That book does that beautifully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but when we
but it
forget
is a city
that's
book.
When we're in a,
it is
in
a
problem.
city book.
Well, we've heard Sarah's 2 favorite books. How about the rest of you? Can you give? We have a stack here. Can you give a couple books from the collection that we sell on our website, that we have in our grade packages, that illustrate these themes?
We start really early with the agrarian theme. And you and I were looking earlier at this little book by Margaret Wise Brown. This is in our preschool curriculum, Big Red Barn. And it, at first you think it's in a big green field. You think it's just like, this is what a horse looks like, but it's really not. It's like the day in the life of these animals and what they do in the daytime. Mm-hmm. And then as the day ends, what they do at night, and they all go back to the big red barn. And it's that life cycle that is so prevalent in Farmer Boy and Ox Cart Man. So this is like 3 years old. And then we do Ox Cart Man in, I think, 1st or 2nd grade. And it's that life cycle again where you see him preparing all of the things that he's got to sell, and then he goes off and sells them, and then he starts all over again.
And don't we use Ox Cart Man in economics?
in
high school economics?
Our high school economics teacher at Memorial Academy decided he needed to introduce the idea of economics with Ox Cart Man.
I love that idea, and I'm struggling to get our teachers on board with this, but I think we should introduce most everything we do with a picture book that reminds students So our teachers, our grammar school teachers, haven't read these books necessarily, but they do connect. I think to read Ox Cart Man before reading Farmer Boy, because the kids will remember this book, and it meant something to them. And then when they read Farmer Boy and they have that life cycle and that sustainability and, and Farmer Boy has some of that city country conflict. And we've got a couple of these, and one is Sarah's favorite book, The Little House, and Farewell to Shady Glade, which these are both books that really deal with the conflict between city and country. These little animals lose their home to bulldozers and
the expanding
and they
city.
And the Little House is the same thing. She just is all of a sudden surrounded by pollution and city streets and lots of loud noises, and then somebody actually loves her and moves the house back to the country. So it seems like a lot of times I think you could get the idea that we are, that when you talk about the theme of agrarianism, that you're anti-city. But I think the important thing is that we also have books in our curriculum that deal with city life and the good things about community in a city. Examples are Make Way for Ducklings was the first one on my list. The Moffats, A Bear Called Paddington, Cricket in Times Square, all of those books take place in large cities in community. And so we also are talking about that, but the value to an agrarian lifestyle is that you are closer to God on God's created land rather than, I think anybody would agree with that, rather than, a skyscraper.
Yeah, can I expand on that point?
Yes.
Because we live very abstract lives, and we surround ourselves with artificiality. Most of the things in the studio we're in right now are man-made, and the ancient philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, would talk about things having natures. Real things have natures in a way that artificial things do not. Right? Aristotle uses the example of a bed. If you have a wooden bed, and you were to take a piece of that would and you planted it somewhere and it sprouted, it would not sprout a bed. It would sprout a tree, right? And so what we've done is we've surrounded our things with all these things that don't have real natures. And so I think one of the reasons that agrarian literature is important is to put us back in touch with real reality.
It's able to convey.
Whether we live in the city or the country. And I think that's another important point is if we live in the city, and most of us do, we need that reminder of the land and the importance of the land and the importance of farmers. And I've typed a lot of letters for Wendell Berry where people say, well, I live in New York, but I want to come to Kentucky and be a farmer and I'm a doctor now. How can I help me make this move? And he's like, you don't need to do it. You need to continue being a doctor because he said, even people who know how to farm can't make money farming. They can't support their families farming. But what you need to do is support the farm communities around you. You need to support farmers markets and you need to support anything that would help your local farmers that surround you. And that's what you can do. So we're not anti-city.
No, but in classical literature really talks about this. Country life is associated with virtue. The farm life is associated with the virtue in a way that the city is not. And so like the story of Cincinnatus, for example, when he gives up power, which he could have become a dictator, but because he saved Rome, but he didn't. He went back to his farm. He went back to the plow. And that whole principle is reiterated in the story of George Washington, who serves 2 terms as president and goes back to his farm. And people at the time even compared him to Cincinnatus. There's one of the themes throughout literature for thousands of years is this connection between the farm and a virtuous life in a way that is not done with the city.
I, for a few years, Tanya, remember this, I was on a high horse that nothing good comes from the city. And
even though he grew up in a city.
Yes. And I am not good, Tanya. The Bible teaches me that. But there's absolutely elements of, I couldn't farm right now without an off-farm job, right? So there is that sort of struggle, and you see that in anything. In Anna Karenina, that's Levin struggling between sort of all the concerns of the political class, and yet he's got these peasants over here that work for him on his land. And what does he really want to do? He really wants to go out and mow, right, with the peasants, cut the hay, right? And so you've got those struggles, and the reality is the human race as a society, we need both, right?
We do need both. And I think that would be Wendell's point.
Yeah.
And I asked Wendell about this one time. What if you're not a farmer? He said, plant a garden.
Yeah.
It'd be a big garden too.
Yeah.
It gets too big, it's a farm. But but also you've got Anna Karenina in front of you there, which is a very agrarian novel. But there's Tolstoy and there's Dostoevsky, the 2 maybe greatest of all the novelists. And it's interesting to me, and I've written on this, that Tolstoy writes, he exalts the farm life in his books, and he has the country to flee to. But the characters in Dostoevsky's novels, they don't have a country to flee to. They're tortured souls because of living in all this artificiality and abstraction. It's not good for your soul if that's all you have. You need something in your life to free you of the artificiality, and even if it's just reading an agrarian book.
Well, and I think this is very, very appropriate for our day and age. I was just listening to a whole history of cemeteries and how cemeteries used to be the place where you would go out and have a picnic, right? Like you would have a picnic next to the tombstone of your loved one. And we just don't do that anymore. But why? Because cemeteries were green spaces.
They were.
And that was a place where you could go out. There'd be trees and there'd be creeks and there'd be,
Yes, and it would be peaceful.
Right. And we do that, those sorts of things in a city, we do less and less. And, I'm sitting over here as I moved out, I got into hunting, but I've got my animals to take care of. I plant plants every spring, and like I've got a whole bunch of other stuff. And I'm sitting over here looking at Corbin and Ian and Mitchell, who all live in the city, but they seem to have more time in their schedule for hunting and fishing. And I would love that. And I realized I could have made a very different decision and just stayed in the city and then just had weekends to dedicate to going out and hunting and fishing. But I've chosen a different path. And so there's different ways to connect to the natural world.
But think how many eggs you're providing to the city dwellers.
Oh, no, I'm absolutely, I don't regret.
Do what you would really like.
I do not regret for a second what I've done. But there are ways to still be in the city and take advantage of the benefits that the country gives you. There's ways to be in the country and take advantage of what the city gives you. But this is an understanding of the other, right? And I think in our day and age, we pit these two things. Like we always, I think as human beings in all ages, we love dichotomies. It's either this or it's that. And this is a struggle. We see this, but I think in every great book, you start to see that it's a both and, right? It's a this and a that. And yet, if we live in the city and we're like, well, all those rural folks are backwards, well, we're not understanding the other, right? And that's a whole part of the humanities is learning the other.
And that's one of the reasons we have parks. Right? I mean, there's a park right near our house.
Yes.
And just to go there on the weekend and just to walk the trails, there's something that's good for your soul about that.
You know what we miss today? We need commons. We need to bring the commons back. You know what the commons were? The commons.
The commons.
Oh, I thought you said comments.
I did too.
Oh, no, commons.
No, we don't want more comments.
No, we don't.
Yes, we do. Podcast at memoriapress.com.
But we need
what?
We need a green space where the farmers bring in their sheep or their goats to graze.
Yes.
Because that's what the commons were. That's the battle on the commons up in Massachusetts during the Revolutionary War. That was those battles. That's where the farmers would bring their sheep to graze.
Oh, it's all through literature, those little cozy stories.
But you would have a
like
town.
Elizabeth Gaskell.
Right, but the town couldn't separate the agriculture from their daily life.
Right.
Right. And that's.
And I think Farmer Boy does it's probably out of our curriculum until you get to something like Anna Karenina, but I think it does the best job of showing the conflict between city and country, but that neither is bad and that both are needed. And that, the things that it's very obvious in here what they need from the city. And then, Almanzo's brother, Royal, decides to go live in the city and to be a city worker. And Almanzo makes the decision to stay on the farm. And neither one is a bad thing. It's just their personal preference. So I do think in the third grade, we do a fine job with this book of showing both. Whereas a couple of these books are really definitely, Heidi is definitely, Heidi even, the Alps, she's higher, she's closer to God, she goes down to the city, she's miserable, she gets ill, she's just wasting away, and she goes back up to the country and is healthy again, happy again, and then Clara comes, who's crippled, and she actually becomes well. Like the country heals her. The fresh milk. It's a beautiful book, but it is more city bad forward.
Well, and that sort of parallels what Paul was talking about in Anna Karenina, where Levin goes out into the country and just that experience of going out and haying, that one particular scene where I think, if I recall, that's when after Kitty has rejected him, and he goes out and he goes to working in the fields with the peasants, and he makes this comment somewhere in there. He says, there's no malady that cannot be cured by a hard day's work in physical labor.
I'm amazed.
Sweating
You can't remember what day it is, but you can remember that. And how long's it been?
It's the 10th, isn't it?
No.
Oh.
It's the 13th.
Tomorrow's Valentine's
Day. Please remember for Joyce's sake.
Yes. Right. I mean, he has to go to the city to find a wife, but then he takes her out into the country.
But this also has that dichotomy you were talking about. Anna and Vronsky City, bad.
Yeah.
Yes.
Levin and Kitty, country, good.
And there's a way that literature is a vehicle for those themes that just maybe a news article or, something else wouldn't be.
Well, I mean, one of the most powerful moments in Anna Karenina is right where you've got these country folks, if we can call Levin and Kitty country, where Levin's brother is dying in a city with a prostitute living with him. And Kitty, well, Levin says, I got to go visit my brother. He's dying. And Kitty says, I'm coming with you. He says, no, you're not. And she says, yes, I am. And she forces Levin to take her with her. And she knows how to love in the squalor in a way that nobody else has loved Levin's brother. Levin himself doesn't know how to, right? Because Levin's on this journey as well. And that, right, is like she made that little room where Levin's brother was dying into a very, very beautiful place.
And she is, there's all kinds of sort of things implied in the book. She's, her country nature, she's darker complected. In the movie, I think it says in the book, and in the movie, there's a scene where it just has her hand is sitting somewhere, and the camera hones in her hand, and her fingernails are short. She's got darker skin. This sort of the implication. These are not just city hands. These are country. These are working hands. And I think that's all throughout Tolstoy. I think Tolstoy's the greatest of the agrarian writers.
Well, and I don't know where it makes the point in these books, but one thought that I've had about agrarianism is it puts one closer to the need to work to survive. Whereas in the city, everything's provided. If you need something, you just go to the grocery store. Sort of that's the mentality you live in. Whereas in the rural area, you have to plan so that you have the food when you need it. When you need something, you don't. It's not just a 5-minute go to the corner store and get it, and that forces you to submit more to the idea of a creator and being created. And so I think that's sort of one of these themes that gets brought up again and again is I think it's rare to have a depiction of a rural person who is not a religious person. And
there's an interdependence that they exhibit in these stories with the community and the land and the...
Yeah. Because once you try to do it alone, you realize you can't do it alone.
Yeah, and when God creates man, he puts him in a garden.
That's right. That's where it all starts.
It is. It is. Oh, well, good discussion nonetheless. So thank you all. And thank you for joining us. We'll be back next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.